Thank you for visiting Nancy's Classic Bedtime Stories. I'm continuing in William F. Buckley Jr.'s Let Us Talk of Many Things, the collected speeches, and we begin. Norman Mailer and the American Right, the opening statement in a debate, Chicago, September 22, 1962. Two young entrepreneurs thought to stage a big theatrical event, Norman Mailer versus WFB, to argue the meaning of the American right wing. The huge amphitheater was packed. SRO, because what seemed the entire heavyweight boxing community was present for the championship match 3 days later between Floyd Patterson, defending champion, and Sonny Liston. Mailer arrived with his retinue and demanded cash up front before stepping on stage. It was not easy to raise $1,000 and $20 bills from ambient friends and stagehands. Both opening speeches were reproduced in Playboy magazine. I welcome Mr. Mailer's interest in the American right wing. On behalf of the right wing, let me say that we, in turn, are interested in Mr. Mailer and look forward to coexistence and cultural exchanges in the years to come. I hope we can maintain his interest, though I confess to certain misgivings. I'm not sure we have enough sexual neuroses for him. But if we have any at all, no doubt he will find them and celebrate them. If not here tonight, then perhaps in a sequel to the essay in which he gave to a world tormented by an inexact knowledge of the causes of tension between the Negro and the white races in the South, the long-awaited answer, namely that all Southern politics reflects the white man's resentment of the superior sexual potency of the Negro male. Mr. Mailer took his thesis, easily the most endearing thing he had ever done, to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt to ask her benediction upon it. She replied that the thesis was horrible, thus filling Mr. Mailer with such fierce delight that he has never ceased describing her reaction, commenting that he must be responsible for the very first use of that overwrought word by that lady in her long and very talkative career. Oh, how we shall scarify, the dilettante Englishman reported exultantly to his friends 100 years ago, on announcing that he had finally put together the money with which to start a weekly magazine. How Mr. Mailer loves to scarify, and how happy I am that he means to do so at my expense. Not only do I know anyone whose dismay is more fetchingly set down, I do not know anyone whose dismay I personally covet more, because it is clear from reading the works of Mr. Mailer that only demonstrations of human swishiness are truly pleasing to him, truly confirm his vision of a world gone square. Pleasant people, like those of us on the right wing, drive him mad and leech his genius. Recently, he has confessed that it is all he can do to stroke his anger nowadays, that he needs that anger to fire his artistic furnace. The world must be a cad. How else will Norman Mailer get to be president? For Mr. Mailer, to use his own phrase, has been running for president for 10 years. He means by that he wants the world to acknowledge him as the principal author of our time, numero uno, the unchallenged, unchallengeable matador, the biggest bull killer since thesis. And so those of you who wish to be president must confirm his darkest thoughts and suspicions about you, so that he may give birth to that novel of outrage, which, he gloats, will be, if I can do it, an unpublishable work. It would be a novel so great that Marx and Freud themselves would want to read it, for they would recognize in it, says Mr. Mailer, a work that carries what they had to tell another part of the way. Those few of us who are not needed to preserve the hideousness of this world, so as to fatten Mr. Mailer's muse, are assigned by him the task of cultivating the passion for socialism, which Mr. Mailer finds the only meaning I can conceive in the lives of those who are not artists. They will want a socialist world, not because they have the conceit that men would thereby be more happy, but because they feel the moral imperative in life itself to raise the human condition, even if this should ultimately mean no more than that man's suffering has been lifted to a higher level, and human history has only progressed from melodrama, farce, and monstrosity to tragedy itself. Not very long after writing that sentence, Mr. Miller and a dozen others, including several other presidential candidates, signed an advertisement in papers throughout the country under the sponsorship of a group which called itself the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The witch hunting press, the advertisement said in almost as many words, is suggesting that Castro's great democratic revolution is contaminated by communism. That is hysterical and fascistic nonsense. One or two signers of that petition, Kenneth Tinnan, the English critic, was one very subsequently called before a congressional investigating committee and asked what they knew about the sponsorship of the Fair Play Committee. To Mr. Mailer's eternal mortification, he was not called, thus feeding what Time magazine has identified as Norman Mailer's subpoena envy. Anyway, it transpired that the organizer of that committee was a paid agent of Fidel Castro, who even then was an unpaid agent of the Soviet Union. The insiders no doubt found it enormously amusing to be able to deploy with such ease some of the most conceited artists in the world behind the communists' grisly little hoax. There is melodrama in Norman Mailer rushing forward to thrust his vital frame between the American public and a true understanding of the march of events in Cuba. There is even farce in the easy victimization of Mr. Skeptic himself by a silent screen ideological conman, and it is always monstrous to argue aggressively the truth of the big lie. But I think the episode was less any one of these things than an act of tragedy with dire consequences, not for the players, they are strikingly impenitent, insouciant, but for others. The people of Cuba are also writing a book that carries forward the ideas of Marx and Freud, a truly unpublishable book. Their suffering, for which Mr. Mailer bears a part of the moral responsibility, they must endure without the means to sublimate. They are not artists who count their travail as a stepping stone to the presidency. Consider this. Last spring, a middle-aged Cuban carpenter, known to persons I know, received notice at his 3-room cottage on the outskirts of Havana at 5 o'clock one afternoon that at 9 the next morning his 12-year-old son would be taken from him to be schooled in the Soviet Union during the next 6 years. The father, who had never concerned himself with politics, asked if his son might not, as an only child, be spared. The answer was no. The father spent the evening talking with his wife and sister and on his knees praying. The next morning he opened the door to the escort who had come to fetch his son, put a bullet through his head, turned and shot his wife and child, and then blew out his own brains. That is not merely a personal tragedy, any more than the story of Anne Frank was merely a personal tragedy. It is a part of a systemic tragedy, just as the annihilation camps in Germany and Poland were part of a systemic tragedy. The tragedy that arises not out of the workaday recognition of man's capacity for brutality, but out of the recognition that man's capacity for good is equal to the task of containing systemic horror, but that we are nonetheless frozen in inactivity. The horror spreads, leaping over continents and oceans and slithering up to our shoreline, while those whose job it is to contain it grind out their diplomatic nothingness, and the nation's poets wallow in their own sorrows. The American right wing, of which I am merely one member, clumsily trying to say what Norman Mailer, with his superior skills, would be saying so very much better if only he would raise his eyes from the world's genital glands, is trying to understand what is that philosophy of despair and who voted to make it the law of nations, that we should yield to it. That philosophy which teaches us to be impotent while fury strikes at the carpenter's home 90 miles from the greatest giant history ever bred, whose hands are held down by the Lilliputian Lilliputian solipsists of contemporary liberalism. That word is solipsists. I love William Buckley. He throws some real words in there. It is spelled Solipsists. Cuba is a symbol of American liberalism's failure to meet the challenges of the modern world. If such a thing as Castro's Cuba were not possible, such a thing as the American right wing as it exists today would not be possible as things are. The American right wing is necessary and providential. Why are we now threatened with Castro? Why should Castro ever have arisen to threaten us? That is a question I dare suggest, which the right alone has been asking. If the President of the United States desires a clue as to the answer to that question, he might reflect on a scene enacted 3½ years ago at his alma mater. It was a brilliant spring evening, and Harvard had not found a hall large enough to hold the crowd. The meeting was finally held out of doors, and there 10,000 members of the Harvard community, teachers, students, administrative officials, met in high spirits to give Fidel Castro a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. That is why the United States has not been able to cope with Castro, nor before him the Khrushchev or Mao Zedong or Stalin, or for that matter with Alger Hiss. We have not understood. The most educated men in our midst and the most highly trained, including those who trained the Kennedys, have not been understanding the march of history, in which Castro is a minor player, though at the moment grave shafts of light converge on him to give him a spectacular brilliance. When Castro arrived at Harvard, he had been 5 long, hectic, flamboyant months in power. He had kept the firing squads working day and night. He had reduced the courts to travesty. He had postponed democratic elections until a day infinitely distant. He had long since begun to speak stridently about world affairs and the distinctive accents of Bolshevism. He had insulted our ambassador. His radio stations and newspapers were pouring out their abuse of this country and its people. Things would become worse in the next months, and the more offensive Castro became, the madder we were all instructed to get at General Trujillo. Castro would not get such a reception at Harvard today, but today is too late. Today is when President Kennedy labors over the problem of how to contain Castro. Now, having waited so long, Mr. Kennedy must deal with the doctrine promulgated by Khrushchev on September 11, which states that the Soviet Union will consider any attempt on the part of the Western Hemisphere powers to extend their system to any portion of the communist world as dangerous to our peace and safety. What we have identified at National Review as the Monrovsky Doctrine. No one in power seems to know exactly how to deal with Castro, but there is a much larger problem. We don't know how to deal with Harvard University. If Harvard couldn't spot Castro for what he is and show us how to cope with him, who can? And yet Harvard, so dulled are her moral and intellectual reflexes, cheered while Castro was accumulating the power to engross the full, if futile, attention of President John F. Kennedy, B.S., 1940, LLD, 1956, even while another of her illustrious sons, Norman Mailer, B.A., 1943, was propagandizing for a committee to hasten the unmolested communization of Cuba. Of Cuba, the right-winger concludes, it can truly be said that she was betrayed. That melodramatic word is not being used only by the founder of the John Birch Society. It is the word La Gran Estafa, being used by most of Fidel Castro's former closest associates, who had thought they were struggling all those months in the Sierra Maestre for freedom, only to find that at a mysterious political level, arrangements were being made to use their hunger for freedom and reform as the engine to create a slave state. They, the earliest associates of Castro, were not really to blame. They fought bravely, and one must not fault the working soldiery, for a lack of political sophistication, but there were others whose business it was to know, who did not know, and their ignorance resulted in the betrayal of those men who followed Castro blindly, only to find that they had dug a ditch out of their own cell into a torture chamber. The United States was caught by surprise. The right wing suggests there are reasons why we were caught by surprise, and that we can never be done exploring what those reasons were and how to avoid them in the future. But all inquiries of this nature are denounced as McCarthyite. President Kennedy has told us the government was caught completely by surprise by the East Germans last August when the Great Wall was erected. I believe him, though it strikes me as strange that so massive an accumulation of brick and mortar could have escaped the notice even of our CIA. The result of our failure to anticipate that wall has been to freeze the dreams of one half of Germany and chill the hopes of free men everywhere. In Laos, we were surprised by the militancy of the thrust from the north and the intransigence of the insurrectionary force, whereupon we yielded, midwiving a government whose archetype we saw in Czechoslovakia just after the war. We know, but haven't learned, that coalition governments become communist governments, that who says A must say B. So it has gone throughout the history of our engagement with the communist world, and only the right and honorable and courageous but unrepresentative members of the left have had the compassion to raise their voices in sustained protest. Never fear, our leaders sought to pacify us in 1947. We have established a policy of containment. On the 15th anniversary of the policy of containment, we can peer 90 miles off the Florida coast into Soviet-built muzzles. And on the other side of the world, in Laos, those who fumble trying to define the new frontier learn that it has crept 500 miles closer to us since Mr. Kennedy undertook to set this nation to moving again. It is said of the American right wing that we do not trust our leaders. Nothing could be closer to the truth. Our leaders are not communists or pro-communists, and are not suspected of being so, notwithstanding the gleeful publicity which has been given to the aberrations of a single conspicuous member of the right wing, who made a series of statements which I would put up alongside some of the political commentary of Herbert Matthews, Gore Vidal, and Norman Mailer, as qualifying for the most foolish political prose published during 1961. If you were a Cuban who believed in freedom, would you trust the leaders of America? Or if you lived in East Berlin, or Laos, or China for that matter, our leaders are not communists, but they have consistently failed to grasp the elementary logic of nuclear blackmail. Disintegration is what we conservatives see going on about us. Disintegration and acquiescence in it. History will remark that in 1945, victorious and omnipotent, the United States declined to secure for Poland the rights over which a great world war had broken out. And that a mere 16 years later, who says B must say C? We broke into a panicked flight from the responsibilities of the Monroe Doctrine, which had been hurled by a fledgling republic in the face of the powers of the old world 140 years ago. Back when America was a great nation, though not a great power. It is the general disintegration of a shared understanding of the meaning of the world and our place in it that made American liberalism possible and American conservatism inevitable. For the American right is based on the assumption that however many things we don't know, there are some things we do know, on the assumption that some questions are closed and that our survival as a nation depends on our acting bravely on the answers, without whose strength we are left speaking like Eisenhower, which is to say speaking organically, unintelligibly, rhetorizing like Kennedy, which is to say putting Madison Avenue to work making non-action act, or writing like Mailer, which is to say writing without beginning to know what one is or what one wants, the criticism of Mailer made by his friend, my enemy, Gore Vidal. To win this one, ladies and gentlemen, It will take nerve and courage and a certain kind of humility, the humility that makes man acknowledge the demands of duty. But it takes also a quiet and unshakable pride, the pride of knowing that with all its faults, with all its grossness, with all its appalling injustices, we live here in the West under a small ray of light, while over there in blackness, total impenetrable. You have to care about other people to share your perception with them, Norman Mailer has written. But nowadays, he confesses, there are too many times when I no longer give a good goddamn for most of the human race. It is tempting to observe that nothing would better serve the good ends of the goddamn human race than to persuade Mr. Mailer to neglect us. But I shall resist the temptation and predict instead that those liberating perceptions that Mr. Mailer has been wrestling to formulate for lo these many years are, like the purloined letter, lying about loose in the principles and premises, the organon of the movement of the left finds it so fashionable to ridicule. There, in all that mess, he will, for instance, run into the concept of duty. Why our great retreat from duty? Because our leaders are, when all is said and done, scared. We will take Berlin, Khrushchev told an American cabinet officer a few weeks ago, and you will do nothing about it. Why won't we do anything about it? Because we might get hurt. And so we rush to the great comforting bosom of unreality, who strokes our golden locks and tells us nothing will happen to us if only we will negotiate. Keep sending lots of money, more foreign aid to India, lots more sit-ins to Georgia, and lots more McCarthyites to Coventry. The true meaning of the American right wing, Mr. Mailer, is commitment, a commitment on the basis of which it becomes possible to take measurements. That is true whether in respect of domestic policy or foreign policy. For those on the radical left with Norman Mailer, and for so many Americans on the moderate left, the true meaning of our time is the loss of an operative set of values, what one might call an expertise in living. For them, there is no ground wire, and without grounding, the voltage fluctuates wildly, wantonly, chasing after the immediate line of least resistance, which in Cuba is do nothing. For those like Norman Mailer who have cut themselves off from the great tradition, it is not truly important that Laos has been dismembered, or that a great wall has gone up through Berlin, or that Cuba has been communized. Mailer's world is already convulsed at a much higher level, and he has no ear for such trivia as these. For he views the world as groaning under the weight of unmanageable paradoxes, so that Euclidean formulas, Christian imperatives, Mosaic homilies become, all of them, simply irrelevant, worse than taken seriously. They get in the way of that apocalyptic orgasm which he sees as the objective of individual experience. How strange it is that all the establishment scholars, all the establishment's men, have not in the last half-dozen years written a half-dozen paragraphs that probe the true meaning of the American right wing. They settle instead for frenzied, paranoid denunciations. There is no enormity too grotesque, too humorless, to win their wide-eyed faith. I have seen some of them listen respectfully to the thesis that Americans belong to the right wing out of resentment over their failure to get their sons into Groton. And I remember the rumor that swept the highest councils of the ADA and the Washington Post in 1954 that Senator McCarthy was accumulating an arsenal of machine guns and rifles in the cellar of the Senate office building. Therefore, they took them and beat them and besmeared them with dirt, and then put them into the cage, that they might be made a spectacle to all the men of the fair. And the charge was brought against them by the principal merchants of the city, that they were enemies to and disturbers of their trade, that they had made commotions and divisions in the town. Thus, John Bunyan wrote about the town of Vanity and how it greeted those in the city who came to buy the truth. I am frankly all but ignorant of theology, Norman Mailer writes. If he wants to learn something about the true nature of the American right wing, I recommend to him the works of Presidents Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The end.